The bread was already burning when the knock came. Evelyn Hart pulled the pan from the oven with a folded rag, set it on the iron rack, and stood there for a moment just looking at the blackened bottom crust. Not ruined, just darker than she'd wanted. She'd been distracted, listening to the wind come down off the ridge the way it did in early November, low and mean, pushing against the windows like it was testing something. She wasn't expecting anyone. She never was. The knock came again. 3 solid raps, not timid, not frantic, just patient, like whoever was on the other side had all the time in the world and wasn't particularly bothered either way. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the front room. The floor creaked under her left foot in the same spot it always did, the same spot Thomas had always promised to fix and never got around to. She'd stopped noticing it until she noticed it every single time. She didn't open the door right away. She stood there with one hand on the latch and listened. Wind. The distant protest of a fence post that needed resetting. The low sound of a horse shifting its weight somewhere outside. A horse. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was not from around here. She knew that immediately, not from his face. She didn't know his face, but from the way he stood. There was something in his posture that belonged to a different kind of life than the one people lived out this way. His coat was good quality wool, dark charcoal gray, cut for a man who didn't have to think twice about whether he could afford it. His boots were worn, but well made. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slightly at the brim the way men do when they're trying to remember their manners. He was maybe 40, or a little past, dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that had been broken at some point and hadn't healed quite straight, eyes that were somewhere between brown and something harder to name, the color of creek water in October when the leaves have all come down. "Mrs. Hart?" he said. "Depends on who's asking." "My name is Rhett Callahan." He said it plainly, without the little inflation men sometimes give to their own names when they think the name should mean something. "I was hoping to speak with you if you have a few minutes." Evelyn looked past him at the horse. A bay gelding, well fed, tied loose to the porch rail. Good animal, the kind of horse a careful man kept. "It's cold," she said. You can come in." She didn't wait to see if he followed. She went back to the kitchen and moved the burned bread off the rack and set a kettle on. She heard his boots on the porch boards, then the door closing behind him, then the creak of her floor in the usual spot. She'd been a widow for 14 months. Thomas Hart had died of a fever in September of the previous year, fast and stupid, and without any dignity to it, the way fevers took people. Here, 1 week, delirious the next, gone before she'd finished believing it was serious. They'd been married 11 years. They'd built the original house together, framed it themselves over 2 summers, hauling timber down from the North Ridge in a wagon that was already half broken when they started. The house had 3 rooms and a root cellar and a garden that did better in wet years than dry ones, which meant it did badly more often than not. After Thomas died, the trouble had started almost immediately. First, it was the eastern pasture. A man named Horace Grubb came out with a surveyor and a piece of paper claiming that the fence line had always been 600 feet west of where Thomas had planted it. Evelyn had argued. She'd shown them Thomas's deed. The surveyor looked at the deed, nodded politely, and told her the deed referenced an earlier plat that had since been superseded. She didn't know what superseded meant in that context, and nobody explained it to her. The fence was moved. She lost the pasture. Then the water rights on the southern creek became disputed. Then there was a property tax assessment that seemed to have tripled without explanation. Then a man from the county land office came out to tell her that a section of her north grazing land had been part of a separate parcel that her husband had allegedly purchased on credit and never fully paid for, and that parcel had now reverted to the original holder. She'd never heard of any such purchase. Thomas hadn't mentioned it. There were no papers for it among his things. Each time, she'd gone to town and asked questions. Each time, the men at the county office had been polite and patient in that particular way that means they've already decided and don't care what you think. Each time, she'd come home with less than she'd left with. She still had the house and roughly 40 acres. The house needed work. The 40 acres were mostly scrubland on the west side. Not good for much except keeping her out of complete poverty, which she supposed was the point. She'd thought about leaving. She thought about it the way you think about a door you've already decided not to open, knowing it's there, knowing you could, choosing not to. Her grandmother had homesteaded this land. Her mother had been born in a sod house 2 miles east of where the current house stood, back before there was a house. Evelyn had been a girl here. She'd buried Thomas here. She wasn't going anywhere. Rhett Callahan sat at her kitchen table and accepted the coffee she offered him without making a production of it. He didn't tell her it was good when it wasn't particularly. He didn't look around the kitchen in that way people sometimes did, cataloging the wear on things, the modest state of everything, and then pretend they hadn't. "Mr. Callahan," Evelyn said, sitting down across from him with her own cup. "You know my name, which means someone in town told you where to find me. I'd like to know why you came." He nodded, set the coffee cup down. "I'm going to be straightforward with you because I think you're a woman who prefers it that way." "I am. I've been in Harlow County for about 3 weeks," he said. "I came originally on business. My family has some land holdings in the northern section of the territory that need looking after. But while I was here, I started hearing about a pattern of property disputes, families losing land, deed challenges that didn't make sense, tax reassessments that seemed to have no basis." Evelyn said nothing. "I've heard your name mentioned more than once in connection with that pattern," he said. "Not in a bad way. More like people are watching to see what happens to you. Like your situation is an example of something." "An example of what?" He picked up the cup again, turned it slightly. "Of what happens when someone doesn't have the right connections, or the right amount of money to make a problem go away." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "What is it you want from me, Mr. Callahan?" "I want to look at your deed," he said, "and any other papers your husband kept. Land records, survey plats, receipts, anything like that." "Why?" "Because I think something is wrong with the title records in this county," he said. "And I think if I can find enough examples, enough documentation, I can bring it to someone who can do something about it." Evelyn studied his face. She'd had men come to her door in the past 14 months. The county assessor, the surveyor, Grubb, with his paper and his polite condescension. She'd learned to read what was behind a man's expression when he showed up uninvited. Some men came with papers and took things. Some men came with concern and took other things. "You're a Callahan," she said. "I am. Your family owns the Double C north of Laramie." Among other things. She'd heard of the Callahans. Everyone had. They were the kind of family that had been in Wyoming long enough to have their name on a river bend and a township road and a stand of cottonwoods that everybody called the Callahan trees, even though the Callahans had been dead for 2 generations. Rhett was, she understood, the surviving line of that family, the one who'd built it back up after his father had nearly run it into the ground. She didn't know the details. She knew the outline. "Why would a Callahan care about what happens to my 40 acres?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his coffee, then back at her. "I don't know yet if I care about your 40 acres specifically," he said. "What I care about is whether someone has been systematically defrauding landowners in this county. That's a different kind of problem. That's the kind of problem that doesn't stop with you." She didn't like him exactly. She didn't dislike him either. He was direct, which she appreciated. He seemed to be saying what he meant, which was rarer than it should have been. But she'd lived alone on 40 acres for 14 months, and she'd learned not to trust quickly. "The papers are in a box under the bed," she said. "I'll get them." "What?" She spread them out on the kitchen table between them, and he went through them carefully, not rushing, not making commentary while he read. He had a manner of concentration that was almost uncomfortable to watch. Very still, very focused, his hands flat on either side of whatever he was reading. She got up and cut 2 slices of the burned bread and put butter on them and set one in front of him without asking. He glanced up, nodded once, and kept reading. Outside, the wind had found a new gap somewhere and was making a high, thin whistle she hadn't heard before. She'd need to find it before winter proper arrived. There was always something to find. "This deed references a survey from 1863, Rhett said. "My grandmother's homestead claim. And this one," he held up a second paper, "is the deed your husband held when you married." "Yes, he bought the east section from a man named Prater who was moving his family to Oregon. That was 1872. Rhett set the 2 deeds side by side and looked at them together. He had a small leather notebook in his coat pocket, and he took it out and wrote something in it. "The surveyor who came last year," he said, without looking up. "Do you remember his name?" "Aldous Fenner. He had a boy with him to hold the chain." "And Grubb, Horace Grubb. You said he had a document claiming your fence was misplaced. He said the fence line had always been 600 feet west. He had a paper that showed a plat superseding the original survey. Did you see that paper? He showed it to me. I didn't understand it. Was there a seal on it? A county seal? She thought back. I think so. I couldn't tell you if it was right. He wrote in the notebook again. The note about the parcel your husband allegedly purchased on credit. Did anyone show you anything in writing? A promissory note? A bill of sale? No. The man from this county land office said the records were on file at the county courthouse. He said I could come in and see them if I wanted. Did you? I went in twice. The first time the man I needed to speak with wasn't there. The second time I was told the file was being reviewed and wasn't available. Rhett sat back in his chair. He looked at the papers spread across her table, then out the window at the gray November sky. Mrs. Hart, he said, how long has your family held this land? My grandmother filed the original homestead claim in 1858. My mother was born here in 1861. He nodded slowly. Have you ever seen your grandmother's original claim papers? Not this deed? He tapped it. But the original filing. I don't know if those exist anymore. They would exist at the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne if they exist anywhere. He paused. Unless someone removed them. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't quite hope. It was more like the moment before hope. The moment where you realize the thing you've been half thinking might be real. Are you saying someone altered the records? She said. I'm saying I've seen 2 deeds in the past hour that have inconsistencies I'd like to understand better, he said. And I've heard your description of a surveyor appearing with a document that conveniently superseded your existing claim, and a county office that keeps having your file unavailable. I'm not saying anything yet, but I'd like to find out. She looked at him across the table. Why? I told you why. You told me why a land fraud operation in Harlow County would matter in general, she said. I'm asking why you're sitting at my table on a Tuesday morning in November. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because yours was the first name I heard, and because from what I've been told, you're still here when most people in your position would have taken what they could and left. That tells me something. What does it tell you? That you know something worth staying for, he said, or that you know something's wrong and you're not willing to walk away from it. Evelyn looked down at the papers on the table. Her grandmother's deed, her mother's name on a document from 1861, her husband's handwriting on a receipt for seed corn dated 3 springs ago. Both, she said. He came back the following Thursday. She hadn't expected him to. She'd thought about the conversation for the days between and had arrived at a kind of settled uncertainty about it. She didn't know if he was what he seemed, didn't know if his interest was what he said it was, didn't know what to do about any of it. So she'd done what she always did. She'd baked, she'd mended the gap in the north fence, she'd brought in the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze. When she heard the horse Thursday morning, she was in the yard with a splitting maul, working through a stack of firewood that needed to last her until spring. Rhett rode in, dismounted, tied his horse at the rail. He stood and watched her split 2 pieces before saying anything. You're doing it wrong, he said. I'm splitting firewood the way I've split firewood for 15 years. Your grip is too far up the handle. You're losing half the force. She stopped, looked at him. Mr. Callahan, I've been splitting this family's firewood since my husband got too sick to do it himself, and before that I split it when he was away, and before that my mother taught me. And I'm not taking instruction from a man who showed up at my door twice. He considered this. Fair enough. She split another piece. He went to the horse and came back with a leather satchel. He sat on the chopping block she wasn't using and opened it. I went to the county courthouse yesterday, he said. Asked to see the land records for this section. She paused mid-swing and set them all down. And? They told me the records were being audited. That's what they told me. I know. I pressed harder than you were able to. He pulled a folded paper from the satchel. The man I spoke with eventually produced this. A transfer deed dated 1869 for 60 acres in this section, transferred from a Dorothy Marsh to a party called Consolidated Western Properties. My grandmother's maiden name was Marsh, Evelyn said. I know. My grandmother died in 1868. I know that too. He held out the paper. This document is dated a year after her death. It bears a signature purporting to be hers. Evelyn took the paper and looked at it. The signature at the bottom, Dorothy E. Marsh, and in handwriting that was careful and slanted and wrong. That's not her signature, Evelyn said. I've seen her signature. She signed everything in a vertical hand because her teacher taught her that way. This is slanted. Forged documents are only as good as the forger's knowledge of the person they're impersonating, Rhett said. He took the paper back and folded it carefully. This is why I need your grandmother's original homestead claim from 1858. If that exists and I can get a copy of it, it will show her actual signature. Against this, he tapped the forged deed. It's significant. Evelyn sat down on the woodpile, not caring that the bark would rough up her skirt. She looked at the ground. Someone forged my dead grandmother's signature, she said, to steal her land. That's what the evidence is suggesting. And Consolidated Western Properties, who are they? That, he said, is what I'm trying to find out. Tch. She invited him to eat that evening because it was late and cold, and the alternative was sending him 15 miles back to town in the dark. She made beans and cornbread, and they ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she asked him questions she'd been holding since Tuesday. What do your people think about what you're doing? She asked. My people? Your family, the other Callahans. Do you have brothers? A wife? No wife. One brother. He thinks I've lost my mind and should come home and look after the ranch. Maybe he's right. Maybe. He broke a piece of cornbread and didn't look up. My brother is a good man. He manages the ranch well. He doesn't need me there. But you could go. I could. So why are you here instead? He was quiet for a moment. The lamp made a small sound. The wick needed trimming. She'd meant to do it this morning and had forgotten. I had a neighbor growing up, he said. Old widow woman named Mrs. Elspeth. She'd been on her land for 30 years. When I was about 17, a company came in and claimed her eastern meadow on the basis of some deed irregularity. She fought it for 2 years. Lost. He turned the cornbread in his hands. By the time I was old enough and had enough money to do something about it, she'd been dead for years and the meadow was a cattle yard. Evelyn didn't say anything. I thought about that meadow a lot, he said. About what I could have done if I'd had what I have now. About whether it mattered that I hadn't known at the time. He looked up. It matters. The not knowing was a convenience I was too young to name. She thought about that. The lamp flickered when a draft came down the chimney. What if you can't prove it, she said. What if there isn't enough? The documents, the witnesses. What if it's not enough? Then we try to find more, he said. And if we still can't? He met her eyes. Then we've tried, and we know what happened, and that's something. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was an honest one, and she respected it more than a promise would have been. The next 3 weeks came in cold and fast, the way Wyoming winters did. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had changed a setting. Ice on the water bucket before dawn, ground too hard to dig, the sky a flat white that gave no particular indication of what time of day it was. Rhett came out every few days. He brought things without making ceremony of it. A new hinge for the barn door that she hadn't asked for, a bag of oats for her mule that she found hanging from the fence rail one morning without any explanation. She didn't thank him for those things because she thought he'd be uncomfortable if she did, and because the thanks would have made them into gifts rather than what they seemed to be, which was just a man who noticed things that needed fixing. They worked through her box of papers together until she knew them as well as he did. He explained the legal structure of homestead claims and transfer deeds and plat surveys in the matter-of-fact way of a man who'd had to learn these things and didn't see any reason to make them mysterious. She learned faster than he expected, she could tell. Not that he said so, but his explanations got shorter as the weeks went on, the way they do when you realize the other person doesn't need the whole scaffolding. One morning in late November, she went to the back shelf of the pantry where she kept things that didn't belong anywhere else. Buttons, a broken pocket watch, a bundle of letters from her mother, and found, tucked behind all of it, a flat tin box she'd forgotten existed. She opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were papers she hadn't seen in years. Her grandmother's papers, the originals, not the copies she'd known about. A letter from the Territorial Land Office dated 1858 acknowledging receipt of the homestead filing, 2 survey plats in her grandmother's handwriting annotated in the margins. And at the bottom, a document she didn't immediately recognize, a signed statement from 3 neighboring settlers in 1862, affirming the boundaries of Dorothy Marsh's claimed land. Her grandmother's signature was on the 1858 letter. Vertical, precise, unmistakable. Evelyn sat at the table for a long time looking at it. Then she went and found her coat and walked the half-mile to the fence line at the south end of her property and stood there looking at the ground. The ground was frozen and gray and stubbled with dead grass. Somewhere under it, her grandmother's hands had worked. Her mother had taken her first steps somewhere on the other side of that fence line, in a place that no longer legally belonged to this family. She stood there until her feet were numb. Then she turned around and went back to the house. She needed to get word to Rhett Callahan. She'd found what he was looking for. He came the next morning, early, riding hard despite the cold. She had the tin box open on the table when he came through the door, and he stopped when he saw her face, and then he came and sat down, and she slid the 1858 letter across to him without saying anything. He read it, looked at the signature, looked at the forged deed he'd been carrying in his satchel. "This is it," he said quietly. Her signature. Both documents. He held them side by side. The vertical precision of Dorothy Marsh's real hand against the slanted forgery. It was obvious when you put them together. It was the kind of obvious that only works if you assume nobody will ever compare them. "They counted on no one looking," Evelyn said. "They counted on the widow selling and leaving," he said, "or dying, or just giving up." She said nothing. He looked at the neighboring settlers' statement from 1862. 3 names she didn't know. He copied them into his notebook. "These men may still be alive," he said, "or their families may be. If I can track them down, that's 60 years ago." "I know, but it's a thread." He looked up. "Mrs. Hart? Evelyn, this is real. What's in this box is real." He paused. "This is going to get harder before it gets better. If whoever is behind this realizes you have these documents, they're going to push back." "They've been pushing since Thomas died," she said. "I'm still here." He nodded slowly. "I know you are." Outside, the wind had picked up again, coming down off the ridge the way it did, low and persistent, not particularly interested in whether anybody was ready for it. Inside, the lamp burned steady, and the tin box sat open on the table, and the papers inside it were older than either of them, and had been waiting, it seemed, for exactly this. Evelyn looked at her grandmother's handwriting on the 1858 letter. The careful loops of it, the deliberateness of a woman who had learned to write as an adult and treated every letter like something worth getting right. She'd been afraid since Thomas died. Afraid in that low, constant way that doesn't announce itself, just lives under everything like a cold draft through a floor you can't quite locate. She'd gotten good at working through it, but sitting here now, with the box open and the documents laid out, and a man across the table who'd come back 4 times when he could have stopped at once, she felt the fear shift into something different. Not gone, not replaced, just accompanied. She reached across the table and pulled the 1858 letter back toward her, put it carefully in the tin box with the others, closed the lid. "Tell me what we do next," she said. The tin box stayed on the kitchen shelf after that, pushed back behind the flour canister where nobody coming through the door would see it immediately. Evelyn wasn't sure why she moved it there. Some instinct she didn't fully examine, the same one that had made her start sleeping lighter these past weeks, waking at small sounds that a year ago she would have slept through without noticing. Rhett had taken careful copies of the key documents before he left that morning. He'd done it methodically, sitting at her table with ink and paper, transcribing every word of the 1858 letter and the settler's boundary statement in a neat hand that was better than she'd have expected from a man who spent most of his time outdoors. He left the originals with her. He said the originals had to stay where they were, that moving them created risk she didn't need. "If something happens to me on the road," he'd said, without any particular drama about it, "you still have the documents." "What's something?" she'd asked. "I don't know yet. Probably nothing. But if the people behind this are who I think they might be, they have enough invested to do more than file paperwork." He'd ridden out just before noon, and she'd watched him from the porch until the cold drove her back inside. The wind had picked up, and the sky had that particular flat gray quality that meant snow before evening. She'd gone back to the firewood and split the rest of the pile and stacked it under the eave, and by the time the first flakes came down, she was inside with the stove burning and the lamp lit and the tin box sitting behind the flour canister where she could look over at it occasionally and know it was there. She didn't sleep well that night. The name he'd mentioned before leaving was still sitting in her head. Consolidated Western Properties. He'd said it carefully, the way you say something you're not sure about yet. Like the name was a door he hadn't opened. She'd never heard it before their second conversation. Now she couldn't stop turning it over. The forgery on her grandmother's deed bore that name as the recipient. Her grandmother had been dead a year when the transfer supposedly happened. Somebody had looked at Dorothy Marsh's homestead filing and thought, "This woman is gone. The family is scattered. Who's going to notice?" They'd almost been right. Dust. Rhett came back 4 days later, which was longer than she'd expected and shorter than she'd been preparing herself for. He rode in mid-morning on a Thursday, and the set of his shoulders when he dismounted told her something before he opened his mouth. She met him at the door. "What happened?" "Can I come in?" She stepped back. He came in, stamped the mud off his boots. The snow had melted to slush in the past 2 days, and took off his coat. He looked tired, the kind of tired that's not about sleep. "I went to see a man named Porter in Cheyenne," he said, sitting at the table. "He's a land attorney. I've used him before on boundary disputes up north. I trust him as much as I trust most lawyers, which isn't saying everything, but it's something." "What did he say?" He'd heard of Consolidated Western Properties. Rhett set his hat on the table and turned it once. "Not under that name exactly. Under 3 or 4 other names it's operated under over the past 15 years. The structure is the same each time, a property holding company that acquires land through contested transfers and deed challenges. It goes quiet for a few years, then resurfaces under a new name." "And who owns it?" He was quiet for a moment. Porter wouldn't say outright, said he wasn't certain, but he gave me a name to look at, Victor Blackwell. Evelyn didn't recognize it immediately. Then she did, not from personal knowledge, but from the way the name existed in the territory, the way certain names did, in the margins of conversations, in the way someone would reference a place or a decision and then mention the name attached to it. Victor Blackwell owned a controlling interest in the Harlow County Savings and Loan. He had significant land holdings in 3 counties. He'd funded the construction of the new courthouse annex 2 years ago. "Blackwell," she said. "You know him?" "I know of him. Thomas dealt with the savings and loan when we needed to extend our note one spring. He said the man who ran it was, he used the word slick, said it in a way that meant something worse." "Porter said Blackwell is careful," Rhett said. "He keeps enough distance between himself and the actual transactions that there's nothing directly tying him to any of it. The holding companies are registered in territorial offices far enough away that nobody connects them to each other unless they're looking specifically for the connection." He looked at her. "Most people aren't looking." We are. He opened the satchel and spread several papers on the table. "Porter helped me pull registration filings for Consolidated Western Properties. It was formed in 1867 in the Nebraska Territory. The registered agent, the man who signed the paperwork, is a person named Edmund Lyle. Lyle is a clerk who works in the Harlow County Land Office." Evelyn sat down slowly. "The same land office that kept telling me the file wasn't available." "The same one." Rhett said it without emphasis, but the weight of it sat there between them. "Lyle has been a clerk there for 12 years. He has a salary that doesn't match the house he lives in or the horses he keeps. So he falsifies the records from inside the office. He would have access to everything, the plat books, the deed registry, the survey filings. He would know exactly which claims had no active heirs, which widows were likely to give up, which parcels had disputed boundaries that could be exploited." He paused. "He would also know how to make a forged transfer deed look like it belonged in the files." Evelyn looked at the registration papers. Edmund Lyle's signature at the bottom, on a document forming a company that had stolen her grandmother's land. She'd probably passed the man on the street in town. Smiled, maybe, the way you did with people whose names you didn't know. "We need more than this," she said. "I know." Porter's testimony about what he suspects isn't evidence. The registration document puts Lyle's name on the holding company, but it doesn't prove the deed was forged, and nothing here connects Blackwell directly. Rhett looked at her across the table. "You understood that faster than most. I'm not complimented by that, Mr. Callahan. I'm just paying attention." She pulled one of the papers toward her and studied it. "The settlers who signed the 1862 boundary statement. Did you find any of them?" "One. A man named Gideon Pruitt. He's 81 years old and lives with his daughter's family outside of Casper. Rhett's expression shifted slightly. He remembers Dorothy Marsh. Evelyn looked up. He said she was a hard woman in the good sense of the word, Rhett said. Said she broke her own ground and didn't ask for much from anyone. He said when she died in 1868, she left the land to her daughter. Your grandmother's daughter. Your mother. My mother never told me about any of this. Pruitt said the transfer to your mother was done quietly, informally. There wasn't a formal deed change in the county records because the family didn't know to file one. It was their land. It had always been their land. He paused. Which meant when the holding company went looking for uncontested transfers to challenge, this parcel looked like it had a gap. An unclear title situation that could be exploited. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. My mother probably didn't even know she should have filed anything. Most people didn't. The territorial land system was complicated and inconsistent, and the people who set it up didn't particularly try to make it easy to navigate. He folded his hands on the table. Pruitt will sign a statement. He said so. He's old and he knows it, and I think he wants to be useful before he can't be. One witness, she said. One witness. Your grandmother's original 1858 letter with her signature, and the forged 1869 deed with a different signature. He met her eyes. It's not enough to bring a federal case, but it's enough to start pulling threads. She thought about that. Pulling threads. The phrase sat with her. The idea that what they had was the beginning of something unraveling rather than something built. You could pull on a thread and find it went nowhere, or you could pull and find it was connected to everything. What do we do? She asked. We go back further, he said. I want to look at every deed challenge and property dispute filed in Harlow County in the past 15 years. Not just yours. All of them. If Consolidated Western Properties, or whatever name it was using, has been operating here for that long, there will be a pattern. The same surveyor, the same clerk, the same kind of documentation irregularity. That's hundreds of records. I know. Porter has a young associate who's willing to do the initial review. He'll flag anything that matches the pattern. He looked at her. But I need money to pay him. And I need your permission to include your documents in what he reviews, because I can't make the case without your family's specific records as the anchor. Evelyn looked at the tin box on the shelf behind him. Her grandmother's letter. Her mother's name on a land that had always been theirs and had been taken when nobody was watching. You have my permission, she said. What do you need from me? I need you to write down everything you remember, he said. Every conversation, every visit from the county office, every name, every date. Anything you can recall about the property dispute since Thomas died. Even things that seemed small. She nodded. I can do that. And Evelyn. He said her name in the careful way he'd begun using it, without making much of it, but not carelessly either. I need you to be careful who you tell about this. Not your neighbors, not anyone in town. Not yet. I don't talk to my neighbors much anyway. I know. But people notice things. If word gets back to whoever is managing this that someone is pulling county records and talking to Gideon Pruitt, he left it incomplete. I understand, she said. She spent 3 evenings writing. It took longer than she expected. Not because the memory was hard, but because once she started, more came back than she'd realized was in there. Small things. The particular way the county assessor had smiled when he handed her the tax reassessment notice, like he was apologizing for something he'd already decided to do. The surveyor Fenner glancing toward the tree line twice while he was explaining the plat irregularity, as if checking whether someone was watching. The fact that Grubb had arrived with his document on a Monday, and the following Thursday she'd gotten the letter about the alleged credit purchase, and that had seemed like a coincidence at the time. It didn't seem like a coincidence anymore. She wrote it all down in her careful hand, the way her grandmother had written, deliberately, treating each word like it deserved to be there. When she was finished, she had 12 pages, which surprised her. Rhett came by on Saturday, and she gave him the pages and watched him read through them at the table while she made coffee. The timing, he said, without looking up. I noticed. Grubb and the credit purchase notice, 4 days apart. 3 days. The notice came Wednesday, not Thursday. I got the date wrong when I was writing it, but then I remembered when I looked at the calendar. He looked up. Do you still have the notice? She went to the box and found it. He looked at it, looked at the date, and wrote something in his notebook. Someone was coordinating, he said. These didn't happen separately. Someone decided to run multiple challenges at the same time, probably expecting that the volume of it would be overwhelming, that you'd look at all of it and just stop fighting. They almost succeeded, she said, but they didn't. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside the window, the afternoon light was already going. December light that didn't have any warmth to it, just illumination. There's something I need to tell you, she said. He set down the pages and waited. My neighbor to the east, a man named Clifton Aldred. He's been there 15 years. His wife mentioned to me in October that they'd received a notice about a survey dispute on their southern boundary. She didn't say much about it, just mentioned it in passing. I didn't think much of it at the time. Rhett said nothing. His expression didn't change, but she saw him go still in that way he had. It's the same pattern, she said. Yes. They'd be another example, another family, if they're willing to talk. He turned his notebook over in his hands. Would they trust you enough to listen if you approached them? Margaret Aldred brought me a pie when Thomas died, Evelyn said. And she's been leaving eggs on my fence post once a week since October when she knows I haven't been to town. I think she'd listen to me. He nodded. Don't tell her specifics. Not yet. Just find out what they received and when. See if there's a name attached to it. Fenner the surveyor? Or Lyle? Or Grubb? Anything that connects. Evelyn looked at him. How many families do you think this has happened to? He looked at the table for a moment, as if deciding how to say the next part. Porter's associate found 14 property challenges in the past 12 years that share the same structural characteristics as yours. Contested survey plats, deed irregularities, title gaps exploited after a death in the family. 14. She'd known on some level, since Rhett had first used the phrase systematic fraud. She'd known it wasn't just her, but 14 was a number she could hold in her head and feel the weight of. 14 families. Are any of them still on their land? She asked. 7? The other 7 either sold and left or lost their claims outright. She thought about that. 7 families who'd been driven off land that had likely been taken from them illegally. 7 families scattered somewhere across the territory or beyond, starting over with whatever was left. We have to find them, she said. Porter's associate is already trying to trace them. Some will be impossible, but others... He shook his head slightly. One step at a time. I know. She stood up and went to the stove to refill her cup. Standing with her back to him, she said, Do you think Blackwell knows someone is looking? A pause. I don't know. What happens if he does? Then things get more complicated. She turned around. That's not much of an answer. No, he said. It's not. He looked at her straight. If Blackwell realizes someone with enough resources and connections to cause him real trouble is asking about his holding companies, he'll push back. He has lawyers. He has local political relationships. He's funded enough construction and enough campaigns in this county that he has people who owe him. He paused. What I have is documented evidence of specific fraud, a witness, and a network of legal and political contacts I've built over 20 years. That's not nothing. It's not nothing, she agreed. What I'm less sure about is timing, he said. The longer we take building this case, the more risk there is that Blackwell's people figure out what's happening. But if we move too fast with insufficient evidence, we'll lose. Evelyn leaned against the counter and looked at him. He was a man who was used to having a certain amount of control over how things proceeded. She'd seen that in him from the beginning. And he was sitting at her kitchen table in December telling her he wasn't sure about the timing, which she suspected was not a thing he admitted easily. Then we do both, she said. Both. We build the case as fast as we can without sacrificing what we need to make it solid. And we move on the witness, Pruitt, while he's still able. And I talked to Margaret Aldred this week. She set down the cup. We don't take our time and we don't rush past the evidence. We just move. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not surprised, exactly. Something else. All right, he said. She went to see Margaret Aldred on a Tuesday, walking the half-mile between their properties along the frozen fence line because the road was icy and she didn't want to deal with the mule. Margaret was a stout, quick-eyed woman in her 50s who'd come from Missouri 40 years ago and had opinions about most things, and kept them to herself unless asked directly, which Evelyn had always respected. They sat in Margaret's kitchen, which was warmer and somewhat larger than Evelyn's, and smelled of the venison stew she had going on the stove. "You came about our survey notice," Margaret said, before Evelyn had gotten to it. "Yes. I figured you'd come eventually. I've been wondering whether to walk over myself." Margaret set 2 cups of coffee down and sat across from her. Clifton received a notice in September. A surveyor came out in October. Man named Fenner. Evelyn kept her face neutral. "What was the dispute about?" "Southern boundary. They're claiming the line runs 70 feet north of where Clifton's always maintained it is, which would take a good chunk of the hay meadow." Margaret wrapped her hands around her cup. "Clifton went to the county office, and they said the records supported the claim. He asked to see the records and was told they were being audited." Evelyn said, "Did Clifton buy that land himself?" "He inherited it from his uncle in 1878. Before that, his uncle had held it since 1865. Before that," Margaret stopped. "His uncle bought it from a family called Whitmore who moved on. There was a deed transfer. Clifton has it. But when the surveyor came out, he said the Whitmore deed had a title defect and the boundary had never been properly surveyed." "Is the deed dated?" 1865. Clifton's uncle filed it himself. He's sure of that because he remembers being there as a boy." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Margaret, I can't tell you everything yet because I'm still figuring out what I know. But I'm going to ask you to trust me for a little while. Don't sell. Don't settle anything. Don't let Clifton sign any paperwork the county sends." Margaret looked at her with those quick eyes. "You know what's happening?" "I think I'm starting to." "Is it just us and you?" "No," Evelyn said. "It's not just us." Margaret was quiet for a moment, one hand flat on the table. Then she said, "What do you need from us?" "Right now? Just the date the notice came and the surveyor's name, and whether anyone else came out other than Fenner." "A man named Grubb came in November," Margaret said. "Said he was from a property management company and wanted to discuss a possible purchase. Clifton told him to leave." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. Grubb. Coming in after the surveyor, after the doubt had been planted, ready with a purchase offer for a family that might be desperate enough to sell. "Good," she said. That was the right thing to do. She walked back along the fence line in the flat gray afternoon light, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The ground was frozen solid under her boots, hard as iron, the kind of cold that went all the way down to rock. She thought about her grandmother walking this same land 60 years ago, breaking it herself, working it herself, building the thing that was supposed to carry through generations. And someone sitting in a warm office somewhere deciding that the widow and the inheritor and the scattered family wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight or wouldn't matter enough to be worth the trouble of defending. She was going to prove them wrong about that. When she told Red about Margaret and Clifton, he added the Aldred name to his list without surprise. He'd already found 2 more families through Porter's associate, one in the western section of the county, one outside the county line entirely, but with the same pattern of challenges fingerprinted in the same way. Same surveyor. Same delays at the land office. And in both cases, a subsequent approach by a man matching Grubb's description. "He's a closer," Rhett said. "Fenner destabilizes the claim, the county office stalls and frustrates, and then Grubb comes in as the reasonable man with the purchase offer. By the time he arrives, the family is tired enough and scared enough to take whatever he's offering." "How much did the others take?" "One family sold for 30 cents on the dollar. The other didn't sell. They just abandoned the claim, walked off and didn't look back." Evelyn thought about that. Walking off land your family had built. She tried to hold that image in her mind and couldn't quite make it real, even having spent 14 months getting pushed toward exactly that. "Grubb is findable," she said. "He came to my door. He went to the Aldred's door. He's not hiding, which means he doesn't think he needs to hide. Not yet." Rhett looked at his notes. "I want to talk to him. Not officially, not in a way that lets him know what we know, but I want to see his face when I mention certain things." "What kind of certain things?" "Dorothy Marsh," he said simply, "and Consolidated Western Properties. If he reports back to Blackwell, then Blackwell knows someone's found the thread." He paused. "Which might be inevitable at this point anyway. Porter's associate has been pulling public records. Someone at the courthouse will notice eventually." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table between them was burning unevenly. She really did need to trim the wick, and the light shifted slightly, catching the planes of Rhett's face in a way that made him look older than he was. "You're not worried about yourself," she said. "You should be, and you're not." "I'm worried enough." "No, you're treating this like a problem to be solved. You're not treating it like something that could hurt you." He met her eyes. "It could." "I know it could. I'm saying you're not acting like it." He looked at her for a moment. "I've had money long enough to know that having it makes you feel like certain things can't touch you," he said. "I'm not naive enough to believe that entirely. But there's a kind of insulation. When you have resources and connections and a family name that means something, it's harder for people to move against you openly." "Harder," she said. "Not impossible." "Nothing's impossible." He said it without flinching. "I know that." She believed him. She also believed that some part of him, the part that had lived well and safely for 40 years, hadn't fully absorbed it the way a woman alone on 40 acres had absorbed it, the way fear lived in the body when you didn't have insulation. But he was here. He kept coming back. He'd spent his own money and his own time and his own political capital on a problem that wasn't his, strictly speaking. That meant something, even if she wasn't ready to name exactly what it meant. "Talk to Grubb," she said, "but be careful what you show him." "I will." "And come back and tell me what he says." He looked at her with that expression she still hadn't entirely figured out, the one that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite distance, but was something in the middle that she'd begun to recognize as simply how he looked at her. "I always come back," he said. She didn't answer that. She got up and went to trim the lamp wick, and the light in the kitchen steadied and burned clear, and outside the Wyoming dark sat cold and enormous over everything they were trying to do. Rhett found Horace Grubb on a Wednesday afternoon in the back room of the Harlow County Savings and Loan, which was either a coincidence or confirmation, depending on how you read it. He hadn't told Evelyn he was going that day. He told her he was going to talk to Grubb, and she told him to be careful what he showed, and he'd said he would. But he hadn't given her a date because he hadn't wanted her worrying about it while she had other things to manage. He'd since decided that was the wrong call. Not because anything had gone badly, but because he was beginning to understand that she didn't want to be managed. She wanted to be included. Those were different things, and he was still learning the distinction. Grubb was a thick-set man in his late 40s with a salesman's habit of smiling just slightly ahead of whatever he was about to say, so that the smile arrived first and the words came after, all of it designed to make you feel like the conversation was already going well. He had an office that wasn't technically an office, a desk and 2 chairs in a space that also held filing cabinets and a hat rack, and the kind of accumulated paper that suggests a man who receives a lot of correspondence. Rhett had introduced himself as a rancher from the Northern Territory, interested in land investment opportunities in Harlow County. He'd given his real name, which was a calculation. Grubb might recognize the Callahan name, in which case the name itself created a certain kind of legitimacy, the kind that came from old money and long tenure, and the general assumption that a man of that background wasn't looking to cause trouble. Grubb had shaken his hand warmly and offered him a seat and asked what kind of acreage he had in mind. "I'm flexible," Rhett had said. "I'm interested in anything with clear title and reasonable access. I've heard there are some interesting parcels available in the county, properties that have changed hands recently." Grubb's smile had shifted fractionally. "Not much. Just enough." "There's always opportunity in a growing territory. What section are you looking at?" "Eastern and southern sections, mainly. I heard something about a property on the south end. Heartland, I think someone mentioned." The smile hadn't disappeared. That was what Rhett noticed most. A man with nothing to hide would have registered the name and either known it or not known it. Grubb registered it and kept the smile very precisely in place, which was a different thing. "I don't believe that one's available yet," Grubb said carefully. "Yet." Rhett had let it sit there for a moment, and then redirected the conversation to other parcels, and Grubb had relaxed and they'd talked for another 20 minutes about nothing of consequence. When he got back to Evelyn that evening and told her about the exchange, including the word "yet," she sat very still for a moment. "He's still expecting me to give up," she said, "or to be made to." Rhett poured himself more coffee from the pot on the stove. He'd been in the saddle since early morning, and his back ached in a way it hadn't 10 years ago. The fact that he's still there, still operating openly out of the Savings and Loan building, That tells me they don't know yet that someone's been pulling records. They think this is still a slow operation. How long before that changes? Porter's associate has been careful, but courthouse clerks talk. He sat back down. I'd say we have until the new year before someone notices. Maybe less. It was mid-December. The new year was 2 weeks away. Evelyn looked at the papers spread on the table. They'd been adding to the pile steadily. Copies of deed records, the registration filings for consolidated Western properties, the statements Rhett had collected from 2 of the affected families who'd agreed to talk. Gideon Pruitt's signed affidavit had arrived by post 3 days ago, sealed and witnessed, the old man's handwriting shaky but clear. Porter's associate, she said. Has he found enough for a federal complaint? He's found enough to support one. Whether a federal land office will take it seriously is a different question. Rhett turned his cup in his hands. I have a contact at the territorial governor's office, a man named Kavanaugh. I've known him for years. He's not someone who does favors lightly, but he's also not someone who ignores documented fraud when it's laid in front of him. Have you told him anything yet? Not yet. I didn't want to go to him until I had something solid enough that he couldn't dismiss it easily. He's a political man. Political men need to know they're betting on a winning hand before they'll commit. He looked at her. I think we're close to that point. Close, she repeated. Close isn't there yet, he said, acknowledging it. There are 2 things I still need. One is a direct connection between Lyle, the clerk, and the forged deed on your grandmother's land. Right now I can show he ran the holding company and had access to the records. I can't yet show he personally altered them. What's the second thing? Someone inside the operation who's willing to talk. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up again. It was always coming up or dying down, the Wyoming wind. It rarely sat still. She'd grown up with it as a kind of background fact, the way city people grew up with street noise, and she mostly didn't hear it anymore except in moments like this, when it was useful to have something to listen to while you thought. Grub, she said. Grub is a possibility. He's insulated enough from Blackwell that he might not be protected if this goes to court. If he understood that, if someone put the choice to him clearly, he'd sell whoever he could to save himself. Most people would, Rhett said. It wasn't a judgment, just an observation. Can you get him to that point? To where the choice is clear to him? Not by myself. I'd need to have enough of the case assembled that threatening him with it was credible. And I'd need Porter there when it happened, because the offer has to come in a legal context, or it's just intimidation. Evelyn stood up and moved to the window. The dark outside was complete. No moon tonight, just the faint blue-white of snow reflecting whatever light was left in the sky. Her own reflection looked back at her from the glass, vague and overlapping with the dark. There's someone else, she said, not turning around. I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks, and I keep coming back to it. Tell me. Edmund Lyle, the clerk. She turned from the window. He's been doing this for 12 years, falsifying records, running the holding company paperwork, facilitating the forgeries. 12 years is a long time to do something like that and not have moments where you hate what you are. Rhett looked at her carefully. You want to approach Lyle? I want to consider it. I want to consider whether a man like that, a clerk, not a wealthy man, not a man with political protection, might have kept records of his own. Something to hold over Blackwell, something to protect himself if it went wrong. That's a significant assumption. It's a human one, she said. Blackwell has everything to lose if this falls apart. Lyle has everything to lose too, but he doesn't have Blackwell's resources to protect himself. If I were Lyle, I'd have kept something, just in case. Rhett was quiet for a moment. She watched him think it through, not dismissing it, not jumping on it, just turning it over in that methodical way he had. It was one of the things she'd come to trust about him. He didn't perform certainty he didn't have. It's a risk, he said finally. If Lyle reports the approach to Blackwell, we've shown our hand. We've nearly shown our hand already. You talked to Grubb. Porter's been pulling courthouse records. She came back to the table and sat down. At a certain point, caution is just delay, and delay is their friend, not ours. You're right about that, he said. I usually am, she said. And it wasn't a joke, exactly. And he didn't laugh. They went to Cheyenne together in the first week of January, which was the latest either of them could call it, and still feel like they were moving at the right pace. Rhett had arranged for them to stay separately. Her with a woman he knew who ran a respectable boarding house on the north side. Him at the hotel near the territorial offices where Porter worked. He'd suggested it for practical reasons, and she'd agreed for her own, which were the same reasons plus the awareness that how things looked still mattered in ways that weren't always fair, but were always real. The trip took 2 days by coach. She'd refused to let him pay for her ticket, and he'd accepted that without argument, which she noted and appreciated. She'd packed the originals of her grandmother's documents in a flat leather case she borrowed from Margaret Aldred, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. Porter was a thin man in his 60s who wore round spectacles and moved his hands when he talked in a way that seemed involuntary, like the hands were working out the logic before the mouth got to it. His associate, whose name was Marcus Webb and who was younger than Evelyn had expected, mid-20s, slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he forgot about sleep when he was working, had assembled the full picture of what they'd found in a bound folio that he set on Porter's desk with the careful pride of someone who'd spent weeks on something and knew it was good. They sat in Porter's office on a gray January morning, the 4 of them, and Marcus Webb walked through what the records showed. 14 land challenges in Harlow County between 1868 and the present. 6 carried the fingerprint of Aldous Fenner's surveying work. 7 resulted in property transfers to entities that traced back, through varying degrees of paperwork, to Consolidated Western Properties, or its predecessor names. Edmund Lyle's signature appeared on the registration documents for all 3 holding company iterations. And in the deed records, which Webb had obtained through a formal records request that cited land research purposes, there were 6 instances of transfer deeds bearing signatures that didn't match the known signatures of the supposed signatories. "How do you know the signatures don't match?" Evelyn asked. Webb looked at her. "I found probate records for 4 of the signatories, wills mostly, which carry verified signatures. The transfer deeds don't match." "That's 4, Rhett said. "What about the other 2? "One of the signatories is still alive. She lives in Colorado now. I wrote to her and she wrote back saying she'd never signed any such document and didn't know what land I was referring to." Webb paused. "The 6th one I can't verify yet. The person is untraceable." Porter took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "What you have," he said to Rhett and Evelyn both, "is a documented pattern of fraudulent land transfer. You have a financial structure that connects the transfers to a holding company. You have a clerk with access and involvement. What you don't have as yet is a direct line from Victor Blackwell to the fraud itself." "Blackwell owns the savings and loan," Rhett said. "Grubb operates out of the savings and loan." "That's suggestive," Porter said. "It's not a direct line. Blackwell will say Grubb operated independently, that the savings and loan merely rented him office space, that he had no knowledge of any fraud. And without something tying him specifically to the decisions, a letter, a record of instruction, a witness." He spread his hands. "Lyle," Evelyn said. All 3 men looked at her. 3 men. "Edmund Lyle is the weak point in this," she said. "He's the one who's been inside the operation long enough to know everything. He ran the paperwork. He had access to the forged deeds. He registered the holding companies. If there's a record of instruction from Blackwell to Lyle, Lyle would have it. If there's any kind of documentation that would tie Blackwell directly, Lyle is where it lives." Porter looked at Rhett. "She's not wrong." "I know she's not wrong," Rhett said. "The question is approach," Porter said. "You can't walk into the county land office and ask the man if he's been falsifying records for Victor Blackwell. And if you try to subpoena his personal records without an ongoing investigation, Blackwell's lawyers will block it before the ink dries." "Unless," Webb said, and then stopped. Everyone looked at him. He had the expression of someone who'd been thinking about something for a while and wasn't sure if it was his place to say it. "Go ahead," Evelyn said. "Unless Lyle already knows the investigation is coming," Webb said. "If he's smart, and he's been running this operation for 12 years without getting caught, so he's not stupid, he might have anticipated that eventually someone would start pulling threads. A man in that position, with that much exposure and significantly less protection than Blackwell, might have taken precautions." "He might have kept records of his own," Evelyn said. It was what she'd said to Rhett 3 weeks ago, and saying it again in this room with Porter nodding slowly felt like watching a small thing become solid. "If he has," Porter said, "and if he understands that the alternative to cooperation is prosecution, a prosecution in which he takes the full weight while Blackwell's lawyers ensure their client walks away, He might choose to talk. Might, Rhett said. Most of law is might, Porter said. You work with what you have. They spent 2 more hours with Porter going through the documents, discussing what a formal federal complaint would require and what it wouldn't, talking about the governor's office and Rhett's contact Kavanaugh and how best to approach him. When they left, the afternoon had turned cold and bright, the kind of winter day that was almost beautiful if you weren't too tired to notice. They walked a block in silence before Rhett said, I want to go see Lyle myself. I know, she said. Porter thinks we should wait until the federal complaint is filed. Use that as leverage. Porter's not wrong, she said, but he's also not the one who might lose his land while the paperwork makes its way through the territorial office. Rhett looked at her sidelong. My 40 acres, she said. The Aldred's hay meadow. 3 other families Porter's man identified who are still in active dispute. She stopped walking and turned to face him. Every week we wait is a week Blackwell's operation keeps running, is a week Fenner could show up at someone else's door. I know. Then let's not wait. Edmund Lyle lived in a house on the east side of Harlow's Mill that was, as Rhett had noted, better than a county clerk's salary explained. It was a 2-story frame house with a painted porch and curtains in the windows and a small stable around the back with 2 horses in it. The kind of house that said comfortable without saying wealthy, which was exactly the kind of house a careful man would buy. Rhett had not told Evelyn he was going to see Lyle the following Tuesday. She'd found out because she'd ridden into town for supplies and seen Rhett's bay gelding tied to the rail outside the land office at 2 in the afternoon, which was where Lyle worked and which was not where Rhett had mentioned he'd be that day. She didn't go in. She finished her errands and rode home and was sitting at the kitchen table when he arrived at her door at 4:30. She didn't say anything when she opened the door. She just looked at him. I went to see Lyle, he said. I know. I saw your horse. He came in and sat down. He looked like a man who'd had an interesting afternoon and wasn't sure how to categorize it. I didn't tell him who I was, he said. Not exactly. I told him I was a landowner from the Northern Territory who'd been reviewing county records for a potential investment, and that I'd come across some irregularities I wanted to ask about. What kind of irregularities? I mentioned the 1869 transfer deed, Dorothy Marsh's name. He paused. He went very still. Not scared. I want to be precise about that. Not scared. Something more careful than that, like a man recalculating. Did he say anything? He said the records I was referring to were in review and he couldn't discuss them. He said it in the voice of someone reading from a procedure. Then he said, and this is the part I want to tell you. He said, I'd recommend speaking with an attorney before pursuing this line of inquiry. Some lines of inquiry become complicated. Evelyn looked at him. That's not a threat. No, it's not a threat. Rhett leaned forward slightly. It's a warning. And a man who wanted to protect the operation wouldn't warn me. He'd either stonewall me entirely or report back to Blackwell immediately. A man who issues a careful, oblique warning to a stranger asking the right questions is a man who isn't entirely sure which side of this he's on anymore. She sat with that for a moment. Or he's a man who wanted to scare you off while keeping his own hands clean. That too, he said. Both things can be true. She looked at her hands on the table. Did he see your name? Did you give him a card? I did not. He doesn't know who I am. He paused. But he knows someone is asking, and he knew enough to be careful about how he responded. So what now? Rhett sat back. Porter filed the preliminary complaint with the federal land office this morning. I got word before I went to the land office. That's partly why I went today. The timeline has shifted. The federal office will want to begin a review within 30 days, which means Blackwell's people will hear about it. When that happens, everything accelerates, Evelyn said. Yes. She got up and moved to the window. It was late afternoon and the light was failing, the way it did in January. Not a sunset, really, just a gradual dimming until dark arrived and you hadn't noticed exactly when it happened. Her land was out there, frozen and quiet, the scrub and the fence lines and the north ridge where her family had cut timber. It didn't look like much in January. It never had. I want to be there when someone talks to Lyle officially, she said. Evelyn, I'm not asking to interrogate him. I'm asking to be present. This is my grandmother's land he helped steal. I have a right to be in the room. He was quiet for a moment, then, I'll talk to Porter about it. Don't talk to Porter about whether I can be there. Tell him I will be. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face, not reluctance giving way exactly, more like recognition. All right, he said. The letter arrived on a Thursday, which was 12 days after the federal complaint was filed, and it was addressed to Evelyn directly, which was the first sign it wasn't routine. It was written on savings and loan stationery and signed by Victor Blackwell himself. The language was polished and cordial, the kind of letter a man writes when he wants to sound reasonable while communicating something that isn't. He expressed concern about rumors he'd heard regarding misunderstandings about property records in the county. He said he'd always been committed to the fair treatment of landowners in Harlow County, as evidenced by his substantial investment in the community. He expressed a desire to meet with Mrs. Hart at her convenience to address any concerns she might have and to explore whether an amicable resolution might be available. He mentioned that he understood she was a widow managing a difficult situation and that he had nothing but respect for the challenges she faced. Evelyn read it twice. Then she sat down and read it a third time. The words amicable resolution sat in her chest like a stone. She rode to town and found Rhett at the hotel where he'd taken a room for the week to be closer to Porter's office. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. His jaw set in a way she recognized by now. He knows, Rhett said. Yes. The complaint triggered it. Someone in the federal office talked, or Blackwell has someone there. Either way. He folded the letter. He's not threatening you directly. He's offering you a way out before this gets worse. For you, he means. He's saying he can make this go away if you take the money and step back. I know what he's saying. Rhett looked at her. Are you frightened? I've been frightened since Thomas died, she said. Being frightened hasn't stopped me yet. He handed the letter back. Don't respond to it. I wasn't going to. She tucked it in her coat. But I want you to know something. He made a mistake writing this. Rhett waited. He addressed it to me, she said. Not to a lawyer, not to a formal representative. To me, personally. He thinks I'm manageable. He thinks I'm still the widow alone on 40 acres who can be talked into taking the sensible option. She looked at him steadily. He's been wrong about me since the beginning. I'd like to make sure he understands that soon. Rhett said nothing for a moment, then, Porter wants to move on Lyle next week, before Blackwell has time to instruct him. Good. If Lyle has what we think he has, then we bring Blackwell down with his own paperwork, she said. That's the kind of justice that actually holds. She said it plainly, without drama. That was how she'd come to think about all of it, not as something grand or extraordinary, but as something that had to be done right, because doing it wrong would mean doing it again or not at all. She'd watched enough things done wrong to know the difference. Outside Porter's building, she stood in the cold for a moment and looked down the main street of Harlow's Mill. The Savings and Loan Building was 2 blocks north, solid brick, recently painted, the kind of building that was meant to communicate permanence and trustworthiness. Victor Blackwell had built things in this county for 20 years. He had his name on, enough to make people assume the name was supposed to be there. It wasn't going to be there much longer. She turned back toward the hotel and went inside out of the cold, because they had work to do, and the afternoon wasn't getting any longer. Porter set the meeting with Edmund Lyle for a Tuesday morning, which gave them 5 days from the moment they decided to move. 5 days during which Evelyn went home and split firewood and checked her fence lines and tried not to count hours, which she was not particularly successful at. Rhett stayed in town. He sent a note out to her farm on Friday saying that Kavanaugh at the governor's office had confirmed he'd reviewed the preliminary federal complaint and found it credible enough to warrant serious attention. The note was short and practical. At the bottom, in handwriting that was slightly less careful than the rest, he'd added, "Stay close to the house. Don't go into town alone until after Tuesday." She'd read that part twice and then folded the note and put it in the tin box with her grandmother's papers. She didn't know exactly what she felt about it. Something between being looked after and being instructed. And the difference between those two things mattered to her, even if she couldn't always articulate why. She stayed close to the house, not because he'd told her to, but because it made sense, and because there was a difference between stubbornness and stupidity, and she tried to know which side of that line she was on. On Saturday, a man she didn't recognize rode slowly past her property twice. She watched from the window both times. He didn't stop. He didn't look at the house directly, but he looked at the fence line and he looked at the land, and the second time he passed, she got a clear enough view to see that he was well dressed in the way of someone who didn't usually ride fence lines for professional purposes. She added it to the list of things she kept in her head. On Sunday, Margaret Aldred walked over with a jar of preserves and stayed for an hour. Clifton had received a second survey notice the previous week, more aggressive in its language than the first. Margaret was calm about it in the way she was calm about most things. Surface calm. The kind that had a considerable amount of something else moving underneath it. "Is it going to be all right?" Margaret asked. She asked it plainly, without softening it or dressing it up, and Evelyn appreciated that. "I think so," Evelyn said. "I genuinely think so, but I can't promise you anything yet." "That's honest." "It's the best I can do." Margaret nodded and took her jar home, and Evelyn watched her walk back along the fence line and thought about what it meant to ask for someone's trust when you couldn't guarantee the outcome. She'd been on the receiving end of promises that hadn't held. She wasn't going to make ones she wasn't sure about. Tuesday arrived the way significant days always did, unremarkably. Cold, gray, the kind of morning that didn't announce itself. Evelyn drove herself into town in the wagon before 8, which she'd told Rhett she was doing when she'd sent a note back on Saturday. He'd met her at the edge of town, as they'd arranged, and they'd walked together to Porter's office, which occupied the second floor of a building on the main street above a dry goods store. Lyle was already there when they arrived. This surprised her. She'd expected him to be brought in reluctantly, maybe by Porter's formal written request delivered through official channels. Instead, he was sitting in a chair outside Porter's inner office, his hat on his knee, his hands folded in his lap, looking like a man who'd been awake for some time and had made a decision about it. He was smaller than she'd imagined. Slight, maybe 50, with the kind of face that didn't hold expression easily. Not hostile, not warm, just neutral in a way that had probably been useful to him professionally. He wore a good coat, too good for a county clerk's wage, and she noted that in the same part of her brain that had been cataloging things since November. Porter made the introductions. Lyle shook Rhett's hand and then Evelyn's, and when he shook Evelyn's, he held it one moment longer than necessary and said, "Mrs. Hart, I know your situation." "I assumed you did," she said. They went into Porter's office. Webb was there, seated at a small desk to one side with paper and ink, positioned to take notes without being in the center of things. Porter sat behind his desk. Rhett and Evelyn took chairs across from Lyle, who sat without being told where to sit, which suggested he'd thought about the room's arrangement ahead of time. Porter opened without preamble. "Mr. Lyle, I want to be direct with you about why you're here. We have documented evidence of a systematic land fraud operation that has operated in Harlow County for more than 12 years. We have records linking you to the holding companies used to receive fraudulently obtained property. We have evidence that deed records in your office were altered. A federal complaint has been filed and is currently under review. The question before you today is whether you will speak with us voluntarily about what you know, or whether you will wait and speak with federal investigators instead." Lyle looked at Porter without any visible change in his expression. Then he looked at Evelyn. "You found your grandmother's papers," he said. "I did." "The 1858 letter." "Yes." He nodded once, slowly. "I told Blackwell that would be the problem eventually. Family land like that, old claims, original homesteaders. There's always something in an attic or a pantry that you can't account for." He paused. He didn't think it mattered. He said old women's letters weren't going to concern a federal court. The room was very quiet. Rhett didn't move. Porter's hands were flat on the desk. "You're saying Blackwell knew about the specific claim on the Marshhart land," Porter said. "He knew about all of them," Lyle said. "Everyone. That was the arrangement. I identified the parcels, he approved the targets, I handled the documentation, Fenner did the surveys, Grubb came in to close." He said it flatly, like a man reading a list, like he'd rehearsed the words enough that they'd lost their weight. "I kept records," he added, "from the beginning. I kept copies of everything." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated than that. "Where are those records?" Rhett asked. "At my house. In a locked box in the floor under my bedroom wardrobe." He looked at Rhett directly. "I want something in writing before I hand them over. Something that specifies what consideration I'll receive for cooperation. That's a conversation for lawyers, Porter said carefully.
I understand that. I came here today because I wanted you to know they exist before we discuss terms. Lyle looked down at his hat on his knee, turned the brim once. I've been doing this for 12 years, he said. I know what I am. I'm not asking you to think otherwise. He looked up. But Blackwell has a lawyer in Denver who's kept him clean through 3 other investigations in other counties over the past 20 years. If this goes to court and I'm the only one holding the bag, I know how that ends.
And if you cooperate, Porter said, then maybe it ends differently. He looked at Evelyn again. Mrs. Hart, I want to say something to you, and I'll understand if it doesn't mean anything to you. She waited. Your grandmother's deed, the 1869 transfer, I didn't write the forgery myself. That was done before I came into this operation. But I knew it existed. I knew it was fraudulent. And when Blackwell decided to start pressuring the current claim, your claim, I didn't do anything to stop it. He paused. I don't have a reason to tell you that except that it's true. She looked at him for a long moment. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. She didn't think he expected any. He was just saying a true thing, which she'd come to understand was sometimes the most a person could do when they'd already done the wrong ones. Tell us what you know, she said. That's what matters now. Booked. Lyle talked for 3 hours. Webb's hand cramped halfway through, and he shook it out and kept writing. Porter asked careful, precise questions. Rhett asked fewer questions, but the ones he asked were pointed in a way that redirected the conversation whenever it drifted toward vagueness. What Lyle described was a machine. Not complicated exactly. Its genius, if you could call it that, was in its simplicity. Blackwell had understood early that territorial land records were inconsistent, poorly cross-referenced, and almost entirely dependent on the honesty of the people maintaining them. If you had someone inside the record-keeping system, you could do a great deal with relatively little risk. The targets were always selected carefully, families with old informal claims that had never been properly refiled under newer territorial requirements. Estates where the transfer to the next generation had been done verbally or with incomplete documentation. Widows. Elderly landowners with no clear heirs. People who had land but not the legal sophistication to defend it when challenged. Fenner would survey and find or manufacture an irregularity. The county office, Lyle's office, would be unavailable, in audit, unable to produce the relevant files. Pressure would build through tax reassessments and competing deed filings. Then Grubb would arrive with the purchase offer. The numbers were always low, always positioned as fair given the disputed nature of the claim. Most people took them. The ones who didn't found the pressure increasing.
Was anyone physically threatened? Porter asked. Lyle hesitated. Not that I was part of, but there was a family in the western section, a man named Beaumont, who had a barn fire in the middle of negotiating a sale. The fire was ruled accidental. He said it neutrally, looking at the table. Nobody said anything for a moment. The records you kept, Rhett said. What specifically do they contain? Correspondence between Blackwell and myself going back 9 years. His written instructions on specific parcels. Which to target, what terms to offer, when to accelerate pressure. Payment records. The holding company registration documents with his actual signature on the authorizing resolutions, which are the versions I kept, not the ones filed publicly. He looked at Porter. He signed everything. He was careful about most things, but he needed the internal paperwork to be legally sound, in case any of his holding companies were ever audited separately. He didn't anticipate someone looking at them from the outside. Porter looked at Rhett over Lyle's head with an expression that was as close to satisfaction as Porter's face seemed to allow. I'll need to see those documents, Porter said to Lyle, after the terms are agreed. I understand. We'll have something written up today. They didn't get the documents that day. The terms took 2 more days to negotiate, which was faster than Evelyn expected and slower than she could bear. Porter worked efficiently, drafting a cooperation agreement that provided Lyle with reduced exposure in exchange for full documentary disclosure and testimony. Lyle's own lawyer, a man he'd apparently already retained, which confirmed he'd been preparing for this conversation for some time, reviewed it and came back with 3 modifications, 2 of which Porter accepted and 1 of which they argued about for most of Wednesday afternoon. Evelyn spent those 2 days in town rather than riding back and forth to the farm.
She stayed at the boarding house Porter had arranged in a small room on the second floor that was clean and cold and had a window overlooking the back alley. She ate her meals at the boarding house table with two other guests. She didn't talk too much, and in the evenings she sat by the window and watched the alley and thought about things. Rhett came by on Wednesday evening after the lawyer negotiations wrapped. He knocked on the boarding house door and she came down to the parlor where the proprietress had a fire going and tactfully found something to do in another room. They sat across from each other in chairs that were more comfortable than her kitchen chairs, and he told her where the terms stood and she listened, and when he was finished she said, "You paid for the rooms here, didn't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Porter arranged it," he said. "Porter doesn't pay for things out of pocket for clients he's known 3 months. You paid for it," and told him to say he arranged it. He looked at her with that expression she'd come to know. "Does it matter?" "It matters that you thought you needed to do it that way." "I thought you'd argue about it." "I would have." Which is not a good enough reason," she said. "Rhett, I appreciate what you're doing, all of it. What you've spent, what you've put at risk. I'm aware of it, and I don't take it lightly." She met his eyes. "But don't do things for me sideways. Don't manage me. I'd rather have the argument than not know." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." She nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire doing its work. "Are you afraid?" he asked. Not about the investigation. She could tell from his voice it was a different kind of question. "About what comes after, if this works." "What do you mean?" "You've been fighting this since Thomas died. It's been over a year of living under it, working towards something. If we succeed, if the land is restored and Blackwell's charged—" He paused. "What comes after that?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't let myself think that far." "Maybe you should start." She looked at the fire. "I think I'd like to fix the floor," she said. "The board that creaks in the front room. Thomas kept saying he'd get to it." She paused. "I think I'd like to fix it myself." He didn't say anything, but something in his face settled in a way she'd noticed before. When she said something that landed with him differently than expected. "I'll come back Thursday morning to get the documents," she said. "I want to be there." "I know," he said. "I'll come and get you at 8. Lyle's house was just as Rhett had described. Comfortable, carefully maintained, the house of a man who'd been paid well for something that wasn't his county salary. They arrived at 9 in the morning, Lyle letting them in himself, and he took them upstairs to the bedroom and moved the wardrobe and pried up 2 floorboards with a short-handled tool he'd clearly used for this purpose before. The box underneath was a medium-sized tin, locked, which he opened with a key he kept on his person. The contents were organized. This was the thing that struck Evelyn first, not that the records existed, she'd been preparing herself to believe they existed, but that they were so carefully kept. Bundled by year, each bundle tied with a different color of string, each document labeled in a small, precise hand. 12 years of paper. Every approval, every payment, every parcel discussed and targeted and acquired. And at the back of the second bundle, held together with a length of red twine, a set of letters in a different handwriting, bold, slightly impatient, the hand of a man accustomed to issuing directions. Victor Blackwell's hand. She held one of the letters and read it without touching the others. It was dated 1874, addressed to Lyle, referencing a specific parcel in the eastern section by its plat number and containing a sentence that read, "Proceed with the consolidated transfer on the schedule discussed." The widow won't contest. Her type never does. She put it down carefully. "Her type," she said quietly. Rhett, standing beside her, said nothing. She picked up the letter again, held it, and set it back in the bundle. She wasn't going to let herself feel what she felt about that sentence right now. She was going to let Porter and Webb catalog everything, and she was going to go back to the farm, and she was going to let the law do what it was supposed to do. Later. She could feel it later. The federal hearing was scheduled for the 14th of March, which was 8 weeks after Lyle handed over the documents, and those 8 weeks were the hardest of the entire year in a different way than the months before them had been. Before, the work was in finding things. Now the work was in waiting while other people processed what had been found, and Evelyn was considerably better at the former. Porter filed the formal complaint with the expanded documentation. The federal land office opened a full investigation. Kavanaugh at the governor's office issued a public statement about the integrity of territorial land records that didn't mention Blackwell by name, but was clearly about him, which caused 3 days of pointed conversation in every establishment in Harlow County. Blackwell's Denver lawyer arrived on the 12th of February, which Evelyn heard about from Margaret, who'd heard it from her husband, who'd heard it in the feed store. Blackwell himself had not responded to the investigation publicly. He'd closed the Savings and Loan Office temporarily for what was described as routine review. Grubb had left town. Nobody knew where. And this was interesting because it suggested either that Blackwell had cut him loose or that Grubb had made his own calculation about his odds and acted on it. Fenner, the surveyor, had, according to Porter's intelligence, retained his own lawyer and was reportedly in conversation with the federal investigator about what kind of cooperation might be of interest. The operation was coming apart the way things came apart when the first thread was properly pulled. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, each piece pulling on the next. Edmund Lyle remained in town, which surprised people who expected him to run. He went to work each day at the county land office, where he was now under formal administrative suspension, but still required to be available for questions. He was, by all accounts, cooperating fully. He looked, according to Margaret's description when she saw him in the street, like a man who had put something down that had been very heavy and was not yet sure how to walk without it. Evelyn didn't find it in herself to feel sorry for him, but she understood what Margaret was describing. She spent the 8 weeks doing what she always did. The farm didn't stop needing attention because the world outside it was complicated. She brought the mule in before the late February storm and fixed the loose board in the barn roof and went through her seed inventory for spring planting. She split more firewood than she needed because splitting firewood was the thing she did when her mind needed to be quiet. Rhett came out to the farm twice a week. Sometimes there was specific business to discuss, a document Porter needed her input on, a question about the timeline of a particular property dispute she'd written up in her notes. Sometimes there wasn't, and he'd arrive and they'd drink coffee and he'd fix whatever was broken that week. A hinge, a fence post, the broken handle on the root cellar door, and they'd talk about things that weren't the case. She told him about her grandmother once, properly, not just the legal history but the woman herself, what her mother had told her. He listened in the way he had of listening, without filling up the spaces. "You're going to have to testify," he said one evening in late February. "At the hearing, Porter wants you to present the original documents." "I know." "It won't be easy. Blackwell's lawyer will try to challenge the authenticity of everything." "I know that too." He looked at her across the table. "Are you ready for it?" She thought about it. "I don't know if ready is the right word," she said. "I don't think I'll be frightened of it, if that's what you mean. I've been scared in my kitchen alone at night. I don't think I'll be scared in a room where other people can see me." He nodded slowly. "That's probably more than ready." "What about you?" she asked. "Your brother. What does he say about all this now?" Rhett smiled slightly. It was the first time she'd seen him smile in a few days, and it changed his face more than she always remembered it did. "He says I've lost my mind and found it again somewhere unhelpful." "Does he mean me?" "He means the whole situation." He paused. "He also came down from the ranch last month to meet Porter and review the documents because he's not actually as uninvested as he pretends to be. He just has a low tolerance for admitting that things matter to him. He sounds like someone I know." Rhett looked at her. "I'll take that as accurate," he said. She got up to refill the coffee, and when she turned back, he was still looking at her with that expression she'd spent months trying to name and had finally stopped trying to name, because some things were what they were and didn't need to be categorized to be true. The night before the hearing, she sat at the kitchen table with her grandmother's tin box open in front of her. She took out the 1858 letter and held it, as she'd done several times over the past months. Dorothy Marsh's handwriting, vertical and careful, a woman who'd broken this ground herself and built something on it and expected it to hold. She thought about the sentence in Blackwell's letter. Her type never does. The assumption embedded in it that certain kinds of women, in certain kinds of situations, didn't have the resources or the will or the knowledge to push back. That poverty and widowhood and isolation were sufficient to keep a person manageable. She put the letter back in the box. She checked the latch on the root cellar. She banked the stove for the night. She stood in the front room for a moment in the dark, feeling the house around her. the imperfect, hand-built, drafty, creaking house that her family had made and that was hers and that she was going to keep. The floorboard creaked under her left foot in the usual spot. She was going to fix that, she thought again. Herself, when this was over. First thing, she went to bed. She didn't sleep easily, but she slept. The federal hearing was held in Cheyenne, in a building that smelled of wood polish and old paper and the particular kind of institutional seriousness that comes from high ceilings and narrow windows. Evelyn had been in courtrooms twice before in her life. Once when Thomas had a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher that settled before anything was decided, and once as a girl when her mother had taken her to watch a land claim hearing for reasons she hadn't understood at the time. She'd been bored then. She was not bored now. The room held perhaps 60 people when it filled. She hadn't expected that. She'd thought of this as a legal proceeding between a small number of specific parties, and in the formal sense it was, but the word had traveled. Through Porter's network, through Kavanaugh's office, through the quiet conversations that move between people when something important is happening, and they understand it to be important even before they can say exactly why. Families she didn't know sat in the rows behind her. Two men she recognized from the list Porter's associate had compiled, families who'd lost land in Harlow County and left, had made the journey back to be present. The Aldreds were there. Clifton sat with his hat on his knee, the same way Lyle had sat in Porter's office, and Margaret sat very straight beside him and looked like a woman who was prepared to wait as long as necessary. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table with Porter on her left and Rhett one row behind her. She had the tin box on the table in front of her. She'd carried it herself from the boarding house that morning, the same flat leather case she'd borrowed from Margaret all those months ago and never quite gotten around to returning. The federal examiner was a man named Holt, who had the bearing of someone who'd been doing this long enough to be unsurprisable, which Evelyn decided was probably what you wanted in a federal examiner. He reviewed preliminary documents for the first 20 minutes without addressing anyone in particular, just working through papers in the methodical way of a man who understood that thoroughness at the beginning saved problems later. Blackwell's Denver lawyer was named Garfield Pruitt. No relation to old Gideon, just the same name, which was one of those small ironies that didn't mean anything. And he was very good at his job in a way Evelyn could assess even from across the room. He was young for the reputation he had, maybe 35, and he had the kind of confidence that came from winning frequently and knowing it. He'd challenged the admissibility of Lyle's documents in a pre-hearing filing that Porter had spent 3 days responding to. Examiner Holt had ruled the documents admissible. Pruitt, the lawyer, had accepted that ruling with a small nod and immediately begun restructuring his approach, which Evelyn watched him do from across the room and found herself respecting in the way you could respect competence even when it was working against you. Blackwell himself sat at the defense table. She'd seen him once before, 2 years ago at a county harvest gathering that she and Thomas had attended, though she hadn't known who he was at the time. He was a large man, well built for his age, which she put at 60 or a little past. He had white hair and a composed face, and the posture of a man who had been the most significant person in most rooms he'd entered for a long time. He didn't look at Evelyn. Not once in the entire morning did he look at her table. She thought about what Rhett had said months ago. They counted on the widow selling and leaving. She thought about the letter she'd burned. She'd written a draft of a response once, in January, alone at the kitchen table at midnight, just to see what she'd say if she were going to say it. Then she'd burned it because she wasn't going to say it. Not to him directly, not in a letter. What she had to say, she was going to say here, in this room, with documentation. Ba-bum. Porter presented the case in the methodical, slightly dry manner that Evelyn had learned was his default mode, and that she'd also learned was more effective than it seemed. He didn't perform. He didn't make speeches. He laid things out in order and explained their significance and moved to the next thing. It had the cumulative effect of a wall being built one careful brick at a time, each element modest on its own, the whole thing substantial by the time you stepped back and looked. The forged deed bearing Dorothy Marsh's signature. The 1858 homestead letter with Dorothy Marsh's actual signature. The two placed side by side for the examiner, who looked at them for a considerable amount of time without comment. The registration documents for Consolidated Western Properties and its two predecessor names with Edmund Lyle's signature on each. The 12 years of internal correspondence from Lyle's tin box, organized by year, including 8 letters in Victor Blackwell's own hand giving specific instructions on specific parcels. The statements from affected families. 5 had agreed to provide sworn statements. 3 had come in person. A woman named Della Hartwick, whose family had lost 80 acres in 1876 and moved to Colorado, sat in the gallery and gave her statement in a voice that was steady and quiet, and that nobody in the room had any trouble hearing. Gideon Pruitt's affidavit read into the record by Webb the old man's words about Dorothy Marsh, a hard woman in the good sense of the word, landing in the room in a way that went briefly quiet after. And then Porter called Evelyn. She'd prepared what she was going to say. She'd written notes, reviewed them, revised them, and then set them aside because she'd decided she didn't want to read from paper. She wanted to say what she knew in the order she knew it, the way she'd told it to Rhett across her kitchen table in November, the way a person talks when they're telling the truth about something they actually lived. She sat in the witness chair and Porter asked her first about the history of the land, her grandmother's homestead, her mother's birth there, the informal inheritance, the absence of a formal refiling that had created the vulnerability the fraud had exploited. Then he asked her about the months after Thomas died. She told it plainly. Grub at the door, the surveyor, the county office, and its perpetually unavailable files. The escalating pressure, the accumulating claims, the way each individual challenge could be dismissed as a bureaucratic irregularity until you laid them all side by side and understood that someone had timed them and coordinated them deliberately. At what point did you understand what was happening? Porter asked. When Mr. Callahan showed me the 1869 transfer deed with my grandmother's forged signature, she said. Before that, I knew something was wrong. I knew each individual claim against my land didn't make sense. But seeing the forgery, seeing her name written in someone else's hand, that was when I understood it wasn't a series of mistakes or bureaucratic failures. Someone had made deliberate decisions about my grandmother's land, about my family. How did that change what you did? She considered the question. It didn't change what I was going to do, she said. I was already going to fight this. It just gave me a clearer sense of what I was fighting. Pruitt, the defense lawyer, cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He was precise and relentless and not unkind, which was its own kind of effective. He pressed on the informality of the original inheritance. He pressed on the gap in the county deed records between her grandmother's death and her mother's use of the land. He suggested, carefully, that a title situation as irregular as hers made it understandable. Not right, he said. Not right, but understandable. That county records might reflect uncertainty about the proper ownership of the parcel. Is it possible, he said, that what looks like a fraudulent transfer might be an attempt, however imperfect, to resolve a genuine title ambiguity? Evelyn looked at him. My grandmother filed a homestead claim in 1858, she said. She lived on that land and worked that land for 10 years. She died on that land. She left it to her daughter, my mother, who was born on it. My mother raised me on it. My husband and I built our house on it. The land passed through 4 generations of my family without a formal deed transfer at each step because we were not wealthy people with lawyers, and the people around us understood whose land it was. She paused. The question of who owned it was not ambiguous to anyone who actually knew us. It became ambiguous when someone with access to county records decided it was useful for it to be ambiguous. Those are different things. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Thank you, Mrs. Hart, he said. No further questions. Edmund Lyle testified in the afternoon. He was formal and thorough and answered every question without evasion, which Evelyn thought was probably the most useful thing he'd ever done with the skill set he'd spent 12 years applying to the opposite purpose. He walked Examiner Holt through the internal records methodically. He identified each document, explained its function, described his own role in the operation. When Pruitt cross-examined him, he tried several angles and found that Lyle had, in the course of his cooperation negotiations with Porter, been thoroughly prepared for all of them. The defense lawyer adjusted, redirected, pressed harder. Lyle held. There was one moment that Evelyn would carry with her afterward. Pruitt, trying to suggest that Lyle had acted independently and that Blackwell had no knowledge of the fraud, asked, "Isn't it possible that Mr. Blackwell trusted you to manage these property matters and had no reason to believe you were acting improperly?" Lyle looked at the letter Porter had entered into evidence, the 1874 letter with the sentence about the widow who wouldn't contest. No, he said simply. It is not possible. The room had been quiet before. It went quieter. Blackwell's own testimony was the last thing on the first day, and it was the thing Evelyn had been waiting for without quite letting herself focus on it. He took the stand with the same composure he'd carried all day. Unhurried, self-possessed, the practiced calm of a man who is accustomed to presenting himself as a reasonable authority. Pruitt walked him through a prepared account that acknowledged certain irregularities in county land records, attributed them to Lyle acting without authorization, and positioned Blackwell as an investor who'd trusted a subordinate and been poorly served by that trust. It was a coherent narrative. Pruitt had built it carefully. Then Porter cross-examined him. He asked about the correspondence. Blackwell said he didn't recall specific letters. Porter read sections of specific letters. Blackwell said letters of a general business nature were often drafted by subordinates and signed without close review. Porter asked about a letter that specified a parcel by its exact plat number and named a proposed purchase price and used the first-person singular throughout. Blackwell said his memory of the correspondence was not clear. Porter put the letter in front of him and asked him to read the relevant paragraph aloud for the record. Blackwell read it in a voice that had lost, somewhere in the last hour, about half of its carrying power. Porter asked about Consolidated Western Properties. Blackwell said he was a passive investor in various ventures and couldn't be expected to know the details of each. Porter asked about the authorizing resolutions, the internal documents Lyle had kept, bearing Blackwell's signature, establishing the specific directives under which the holding company operated. Blackwell looked at his lawyer. Pruitt objected on a procedural basis. Holt overruled. Blackwell answered the question. His answer was careful and incomplete and not quite a lie and not quite the truth. And Evelyn watched Examiner Holt's face while he answered it and saw something settle there that told her what she needed to know about how Holt was reading it. It went on for 2 hours. By the end, Blackwell's composure was present in the way of something being maintained rather than something that came naturally. His voice was level, his hands were still, but there was a quality to it that reminded Evelyn of a fence post that looked solid until you pushed it and felt it give. When it was over, Holt adjourned for the day and said he would deliver his findings the following morning. The boarding house that evening was quiet in the way of places where people are thinking. Evelyn sat with Margaret and Clifton in the small parlor after dinner, and they talked about ordinary things. The spring planting, whether the late February storm had done any damage to the Aldred's hay meadow, a colt that Clifton was hoping to sell at the spring market. The ordinary things were necessary. They created a floor under everything else. Rhett came by at 8. He sat in the fourth chair in the parlor and accepted the coffee Margaret poured him and participated in the ordinary things conversation without making it feel forced, which Evelyn noted. He was good at that, at being in a room without filling it unnecessarily. After Clifton and Margaret went to bed, Evelyn and Rhett sat for a while in the parlor without talking particularly. The fire was lower now, just steady orange coals. The proprietress had gone upstairs an hour ago. "You did well today," he said. "I told the truth." "That's not the same as doing well." "Sometimes it is," he said. She looked at the fire. "Do you think Holt believed what he saw?" "I think Holt is a careful man who will reach the correct conclusion from the evidence," Rhett said. "That's different from believing. He's not in the business of believing, he's in the business of deciding." "And Blackwell's lawyer, Pruitt, do you think he'll file something to delay the findings?" "He'll try. He has 3 standard mechanisms for it, and Porter has responses prepared for all 3. He paused. "The documents from Lyle's tin box are what makes this difficult to delay. You can argue about witnesses. You can argue about memory and interpretation. You can't argue with Blackwell's own handwriting on 12 years of instructions." She nodded. She knew all of this. She'd known it going in. She just wanted to hear it stated plainly by someone who wasn't her, because there was a particular loneliness in being the only one carrying a thought. "What happens to the other families?" she asked. "The ones who already left, who took the money and moved on. The federal ruling will create grounds for them to file individual claims to have those transactions reviewed," Rhett said. "Porter will make sure that information gets to them. Some will file. Some won't. Some will have moved on too far, built new things, decided the past isn't worth reopening." He looked at the fire. "That's their right. This was never about forcing anyone back to something they'd already made their peace with. But they'll know," she said. "They'll know they were robbed.
They'll know someone found out and did something about it. Yes, they'll know that. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that woman today, Della Hartwick from Colorado. What about her?
She came all the way back to give her statement. She lives in Colorado now, has for 6 years. Whatever was going to come out of today wouldn't give her her 80 acres back. She's built a life somewhere else. Evelyn looked at her hands in her lap. She came anyway. People want to be part of the reckoning, Rhett said, even when it doesn't give them back what they lost. Maybe especially then. Evelyn thought about that for a while. There was something in it she recognized. The way a thing could matter even after the practical moment for it had passed. The way bearing witness to the truth of something was its own kind of action, separate from outcome. I'm tired, she said. Not in a bad way. Just, it's been a long time. I know. She looked at him. He was watching the fire with the expression she'd stopped trying to name. She'd come to understand that it meant, approximately, that he was aware of something he wasn't going to say unless she invited it, and that he was content to leave it unspoken if that was where it stayed. You came to my door in November, she said, to talk about land records. I did. You could have gone to any of the other families first. Porter's associate had 14 names. He looked at her. Yours was the first one I heard, he said. I told you that. You told me that's what brought you to the door. I'm asking what made you come back. He was quiet for a moment. The coals shifted. You didn't pretend things were fine, he said. You didn't perform gratitude or deference or any of the things people perform when someone with money and a family name shows up offering help. You just asked what I wanted and told me what you'd do and made your own calculations about whether to trust me. He paused. That was unusual. And the longer I was around it, the harder it was to be anywhere else. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, I'm going to fix the floor when I get back. The board that creaks. Yes, I've been thinking about it since February. You know how to do that? I know how to do most things if I figure them out first, she said. Thomas was the one who knew how to do things without figuring. I'm better at the figuring part. I know, he said. I've watched you figure things out for 4 months. She stood up and said goodnight and went upstairs, and he sat by the fire a little longer, and neither of them said the thing that didn't need saying yet. Examiner Holt delivered his findings the next morning at 9. The hearing room was full again. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table with the tin box in front of her and Porter on her left, and didn't look at Blackwell across the room. Holt read for 35 minutes. He was thorough in a way that was almost painstaking, acknowledging each piece of evidence, describing its significance, addressing the defense's counterarguments, and explaining his reasoning for finding them insufficient. His language was formal and precise, and she followed every word of it. The central findings were these. The 1869 deed transferring land from Dorothy Marsh to Consolidated Western Properties was determined to be fraudulent, bearing a forged signature. The original homestead claim filed by Dorothy Marsh in 1858 was determined to be the valid controlling document for the parcel. The transfer and all subsequent title actions derived from it were ruled void. The land, in its original boundaries as established by the 1858 claim, was to be restored to the rightful heir. Her name, her grandmother's land. Coming back, Holt continued. The documented evidence of systematic fraud, forged deeds, manipulated county records, coordinated property challenges, was sufficient to refer the matter to federal prosecution. Victor Blackwell and Edmund Lyle were both named in the referral. Aldous Fenner, who had reached his own cooperation agreement with the federal investigator, was named as a cooperating witness. The matter of Horace Grubb, who had left the territory, was noted as pending. When Holt finished reading, the room was quiet for a moment in the way of rooms where people are still absorbing what they've heard. Then several things happened at once. Blackwell's lawyer leaned in to speak to him. Someone in the gallery exhaled audibly. Porter's hand briefly covered Evelyn's on the table and then withdrew, and Rhett, behind her, said nothing at all. She sat very still. She'd been prepared for this. She'd worked toward this for 4 months, and before that she'd been surviving toward it for a year without quite knowing what it was. She'd imagined this moment in different ways. Relief, vindication, some uncomplicated release. What she felt instead was something harder to name. Not disappointment, Something more like the way a long physical effort feels when it finally ends. When the muscle that has been clenched releases, and the pain of the unclenching is almost indistinguishable from the effort itself. Her grandmother's land, her family's ground. She thought of Dorothy Marsh filing a claim in 1858 on a piece of Wyoming frontier that most people would have looked at and seen nothing of value, breaking it, planting it, building something on it with her own hands in her own vertical deliberate script. Not because it was easy, because it was hers. After, in the corridor outside the hearing room, Clifton Aldridge shook her hand and couldn't quite put together the sentence he was trying to make, and eventually just said thank you in a way that covered everything he couldn't say, and she understood him. Della Hartwick came and found her. She was a composed woman in her 40s with weather in her face and a way of standing that said she'd spent considerable time outdoors. They shook hands. "What you did," Della said. "What we all did," Evelyn said. "Your statement mattered. Coming back mattered. It didn't get my land back." "I know." Della looked at her for a moment. "But it means someone will know," she said. "Someone will have the papers that say what happened, that we didn't just leave." She paused. "That counts for something." "It does," Evelyn said. "It counts." Rhett found her after Della had gone, and after Porter had shaken her hand and mentioned approximately 6 things that still needed to be done in the follow-on process, which she'd listened to and filed away and would think about later. Rhett didn't say anything immediately. He stood next to her in the corridor while people moved around them. "Well," he said finally. "Well," she said. "You're going home. Today, if the weather holds." She looked up at him. "Thank you. I know that's not enough of a word for what you did, but it's the true word, so." "I didn't do it for the thanks," he said. "I know you didn't. That's part of why it matters." He looked at her. Outside the corridor window, the March sky was doing something tentative with light. Not quite sun, but the suggestion of it, the kind of day that makes you think spring is considering arriving. "I'd like to come out to the farm," he said. "In a week or two, when things have settled." "You've been coming out to the farm since November," she said. "That was for the case." "You fixed my barn hinge." "The barn hinge needed fixing." She looked at him for a moment. "Come out to the farm," she said. "I'll have the floor fixed by then." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly. The thing that happened just before 1. "I'll bring lumber," he said, "in case you need it." "I won't," she said, "but bring it anyway." She rode home that afternoon in the wagon, alone, the way she'd come. The March road was muddy in places and frozen in others, and the mule had an opinion about both that it expressed through its gait. The sky stayed tentative the whole way, neither committing to sun nor to cloud, just holding somewhere in between. She passed the fence line at the southern boundary of her property in the late afternoon when the light was going gold and low. 40 acres of scrubland and the house her family had built, and beyond that, east, the land that had been taken, the pasture and the eastern section that the federal ruling would restore to her, that would require paperwork and surveying and more time before it was formally, legally, completely hers again. None of it was going to be handed to her clean and wrapped. There would be more process, more steps, more of Porter's lists of things to do. That was fine. She'd learned by now how to work in that direction. The house was cold when she got inside. She lit the stove and waited for it to warm up and stood in the front room in her coat, just standing there, feeling the house. The floorboard creaked under her left foot in the usual spot. She stepped on it again deliberately, listening to the sound of it. Something loose in the substructure. She'd need to pull the board up, see what was underneath, reset whatever had worked free. Not complicated, just needing attention. She'd do it this week. Tomorrow, maybe, if the weather was decent enough to work with the tools in the cold. She stood in her front room in the falling dark and thought about her grandmother, who had filed a claim on this ground when most people would have seen nothing worth claiming, who had built something on the assumption that what you built was supposed to hold, who had been dead for more than 50 years, but whose careful vertical handwriting on a piece of paper had helped bring her granddaughter's stolen land back. She thought about the people she'd met in the past 4 months. Gideon Pruitt, 81 years old, who'd signed his name to a sworn statement in a shaky hand because the truth of 60 years ago still mattered to him. The Aldrids, walking their fence line every morning, not knowing if it would still be theirs. Della Hartwick, riding back from Colorado to say what happened to her family in a room full of strangers. Edmund Lyle, carrying 12 years of wrong in a tin box under his floorboards, waiting for someone to come looking. She thought about Rhett Callahan riding up to her door in November with his hat in his hands and his horse tied to the porch rail. A man who had every reason to be somewhere easier and had kept showing up to somewhere harder instead. There was a thing she'd come to understand over the past 4 months that she hadn't had language for before. It was this. People are not saved by grand gestures or dramatic reversals. They are sustained when they are sustained by ordinary, persistent attention. By the person who keeps showing up, by the neighbor who leaves eggs on your fence post, by the old man who signs his name to something because the truth deserves to be written down, by yourself getting up every morning and tending to the thing that needs tending even when you don't know yet if it's going to hold. She hadn't won because she was exceptional. She'd won because she hadn't stopped. And because at a certain point she hadn't been alone in not stopping. Those two things together, the persistence and the company, were what the past 14 months had taught her. Not as an idea, as something she knew in her body now, the way you know the weight of a splitting maul or the exact creak of a particular floorboard. The stove was warm now. She took off her coat. Outside, the March wind was doing what it always did, coming down off the ridge, looking for gaps, testing things. She'd lived with that wind her whole life. She didn't mind it. It was honest about what it was. She put the kettle on and went to the shelf and took down the tin box and opened it one more time. Her grandmother's 1858 letter. Her mother's land. Her land. She looked at Dorothy Marsh's signature, vertical, precise, every letter given its due, and then she closed the box and put it back on the shelf, not hidden anymore, not tucked behind the flour canister, just there, in plain sight, where it belonged. She made her tea and sat at the kitchen table in the warm kitchen in the house her family had built, and outside the light finished going and the dark came down full over Wyoming, and the wind moved through the grass of her land, all of it, the restored parts, and the parts she'd held through everything. And it was cold out there, and it was dark, and it was hers. That was enough. That had always been enough.